The following true story was posted on Reddit by Reddit user TheOrangeHouse. My grandparents live in the East Fjords of Iceland, and our family has lived on the same spot for over 300 years now. It's a large area, and our farmland includes a huge mountain in the backyard, with waterfalls, and the ocean in our front yard. Our farm has a couple of houses. The old house is the most noticeable, and it's surrounded by small houses and a barn-looking house. In front of the old house stands our church that my great-grandfather built 150 years ago, and it's in pretty good shape. The previous church had got a bit over 200 years old before it got blown over by a storm, so my grandfather chained our current church down so it wouldn't happen again. There has been a graveyard there ever since the first people came to Iceland, so we know there are a lot of graves on our land, but we don't have a lot of records over who are laying there. My grandparents run a guest house during the summer, and I've been going there almost every year to help them out. When I was young, I visited them a lot by myself, and I loved hearing my grandpa's stories, especially the weird stories that concern our family and our place. They had everything from elves, trolls, ghosts, to hidden people. Just to give you a bit of an idea of what kind of creatures her stories withheld, I'll explain them quickly. The hidden people are a special breed of people. They look just like us, but can be quite charming. They live in the hills, and they control if you see them or not. The elves are beautiful creatures, but very dangerous. They have their churches and homes, and our family even have a small church and a couple of homes that we know are inhabited by them. When I was a kid, we weren't allowed anywhere near those places. Elves really like to steal people. The trolls I never noticed, but we have had many stories of them in the fjords. I love the stories where there are woman trolls that ate priests or made humans into half-trolls and used them. Also the ones that owned and lived islands in the fjords. No one dared to step foot on the islands for a long time. Now that I look back, I notice that almost all of the stories end tragically. The ghost stories were probably the most realistic ones, and we have a lot of them on our land since it's very old and has a lot of bloodshed in history. My story is a ghost story. Even though I was fascinated by my grandmother's stories, I never really fully believed them. I always thought, back in the day there was no light in the winter, a lot of thick fog and very few people, so of course it was easy to fill the empty space with made-up stories. It wasn't until I was almost 13 and I went for the whole summer to help them out with their guest house. I slept in the living room of our house, and there was this huge window overlooking the old houses, the church, and the ocean. I loved the nature and was fascinated by how it was growing and changing with us. I used to take long walks by the ocean or up the mountain during the day, but I always felt a bit uneasy, like someone was watching me. But I never really did anything about it. I just carried on. 2 weeks into my stay on a clear night with a bright full moon, I was sleeping and dreaming quite heavily. All of a sudden my dreaming stopped and I woke up. I opened my eyes and there stood a woman across from me. I didn't recognize her, but she was wearing old-looking clothes. She might have been in her mid-30s. She had mouse brown hair and blue eyes. She was smiling, but not in a creepy way, more in a motherly way, like I was safe. I just stared at her and thought to myself, I can't be so rude. So I told her, "Thank you for coming," and I saw her expression that she understood, and then she disappeared. I sat up and the first thought came up to my mind was that was my guardian angel. I told my grandmother the next day, and she said that I was lucky to have someone looking over me. I never really thought much more of it after that, and just carried on. 3 weeks after I saw the woman, I started noticing a weird feeling, especially when I was in the old house. The same feeling I had when I was alone in the nature, like someone was watching me. In the old house by the sink, there is a window turning to the ocean, and a clock next to it that is broken. It looks like something from the 50s. I don't know why, but it's still there, and we've always had it as far as I know. One sunny day around noon, when I was doing the dishes, after all the guests had left, I got the feeling again, and this time it was very strong. I looked around and saw nothing, so I nervously laughed it off and carried on with the dishes. All of a sudden, I saw a shadow in the reflection of the glass on the clock, like someone had been standing behind me. So I turned around quickly, but I didn't see anybody. I decided that I should go outside, just to get some air. So I go out and take deep breaths and tried to shake that feeling away. But when I turned towards the house and looked into the window in the kitchen, I saw a woman in an apron cutting bread. I was so shocked that I just stood still for a while. I didn't feel scared, just shocked. This wasn't the same woman as before, but this woman I recognized. She looked a lot like my great-grandmother, with long black hair and braids, piercing green eyes, and high cheekbones. I had only seen her in pictures since she died a year before I was born. but we shared the same name, so I always liked her pictures the best. She disappeared after a couple of seconds that felt like a minute. I ran to my grandmother that was in the house and I told her what had happened, and she just smiled and said, "Oh, that's great." She was so happy that her mother was still taking care of the old house. There are a couple of more incidents like that during the summer, but there was one that always stayed out in my mind. When it occurred, I realized I wasn't going crazy, but there was something out there that I couldn't fully explain. In the end of the summer, I decided that I wanted to sleep in the old house before I would leave. I stayed in the room that my mom used to sleep in when she was a child. There were other tourists sleeping in the house, so I felt safe. It was hard to fall asleep since the house was old and it made a lot of sounds, and after all what happened in the summer, I had become a bit paranoid. I wasn't really sure what was out there anymore. I slept the whole night, but my dream was stronger and more vivid than usual. In my dream, I saw 2 kids playing around in the fields of our farm. One boy and one girl. They were both with white hair, blue eyes, and milky white skin. They were quite young, probably around 3 to 4 years old. I quickly noticed a man in the distance that was waving and approached them and started playing with them. He was dressed in old-fashioned clothes, but I felt like I recognized his smile. I had an idea that he was my great-grandfather. When they came close to me, they were all holding hands and laughing. The sun was shining and the grass was green, and I couldn't help but smile the whole time. I wanted to talk to them, but I couldn't. I just stood there outside the old house and watched them play and laugh. Then I woke up exhausted, but happy. My first thought was to tell my grandmother my dream. I met her in our kitchen and told her about the dream. She asked a couple of questions about the man and what the children looked like, and I described them the best I could. That's when she started crying. I didn't really understand, so I asked her what was going on, and asked if that was her father in my dream, and she said she hoped so. She told me that when she was young, she had 2 children before she had my mother, who was the oldest child. The 2 children died a year apart because they got some kind of sickness, and no one in our family knew of them except my grandparents. She explained that they had 1 boy and 1 girl, but sadly they didn't get older than 4 years old. She went into her room and into her drawer and found a little box that I'd never seen before. Inside of it were 2 locks of white hairs tied up with ribbons, some papers and a picture of my young-looking grandparents and 2 small children outside of a church on summer's day. I recognized the children straight away, with their white hair and milky skins smiling just like in the dream. When I went back to the city that year, I was changed. But I always return to my grandparents each year. It's the only place I experience anything like this. It can be the most quiet place I know, or the most exciting, nerve-jumping place I know. Every time I go back to the city, it's like I'm back to the normal. No ghosts, no lost family members checking in. I wonder if this is happening to anybody else out there. And that's the end of this video. Make sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you want to see videos just like this one.